Our presentation is on attachment disorders. Those that will be presenting are Natalie Givens, Robin Newman, Marcy Olney, and Natalie Williams. It's impossible to talk about attachment disorders without discussing this topic in light of God's Word and the fall of man. The fall of man forever impacted the relational health of all people. In Genesis 3, we understand that Adam and Eve were created and God gave them free will. They shared a loving, reciprocal, and transparent relationship with God. Both were naked, and yet they were unashamed. At that time, everything was perfect. We also know that Eve was tempted by the serpent to be like God, and she makes the decision to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which was forbidden. She then shares the fruit with Adam. The result of that choice and disobedience to God was catastrophic to mankind. The most devastating effect was the disruption of mankind's transparent and loving relationship with God. Although we are made in the Imago Dei with the capacity and longing to connect, since sin was introduced into the world and our human nature corrupted by the curse, it has been a struggle for us to connect with God and others. Although attachment disorders are extreme forms of behavior typically resulting from some kind of abuse, neglect, or trauma, mankind has struggled to reconnect with God and others as a whole as a result of the fall. It's interesting to note that attachment disorders were first formally defined as a disorder in the third edition of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980. That manual was subsequently updated in 2013 as DSM-5. For almost 20 years, attachment disorders attracted little attention because individuals were unable to really understand when aberrant behavior was the result of an attachment disorder rather than an insecure attachment type. Today, there is a broad consensus in support of Bowlby's theory that in early childhood, attachment disorders result in inadequate caregiving environments and results in two clinical patterns. We're going to talk about reactive attachment disorder, which is emotionally withdrawn, inhibited individuals, and DSED, disinhibited social engagement disorder, which is characteristic of indiscriminately social and disinhibited individuals. There are a number of experiences that can lead to attachment disorders. I've listed some here, but this is not an all-inclusive list. Each person's attachment style or disorder is really specific to the individual. But some of the reasons could include abuse and neglect, trauma, loss of or separation from a parent, the quality of the attachment that the individual receives from the primary caregiver, the individual's temperament or disposition, whether or not the individual was born prematurely, whether they had any medical conditions before the age of 2, and children that have been institutionalized. There are a number of different effects of attachment disorders, and specifically RAD and DSED. There are learning difficulties, which result in immature speech. Individuals may have learning delays, problems with basic literacy and math, and lack of cause and effect thinking. Individuals with RAD and DSED may also exhibit obsessions. They'll hide food, there's hoarding, they may be fascinated by death, violence, or fire, and they may exhibit eating disorders. In terms of behavior, we see in RAD and DSED individuals that their behavior is destructive, they have no remorse for their actions, they're very impulsive without considering consequences, they question everything, they may steal belongings that don't belong to them, they have inappropriate sexual behaviors, and are prone to substance or alcohol abuse. As far as relationships, some of the behaviors that are demonstrated could be that the individual is clingy or needy, they have difficulty maintaining friendships, they resist affection or comfort, they're very affectionate with strangers, very aggressive, and hostile towards their parents.
Attachment disorders cause us to suffer from many things that affect our social interactions. Many of those things are brought to light and overcome through counseling, which is why counseling is important when dealing with any mental illness, including attachment disorders. Counseling helps break down the thought processes and habits that are attributed to attachment disorders and retrain our brain to look for and gain strong and supportive relationships through new and healthy bonds. Healthy relationships and bonds can help cope with and prevent depression, anxiety, and other mental health diseases. Attachment-based therapy allows counselors and/or therapists to evaluate their clients' lives and their connections between early childhood attachments, the experiences they encountered, along with their relationships in later on adulthood. People that often suffer from unhealthy or insecure attachments have hurtful relationships later on in adulthood as well. Knowing the correlation and the signs of those, counselors and therapists are able to help develop coping skills, rebuild trusting bonds, and also encourage emotional security and safety within a session. Attachment-based therapy allows counselors and/or therapists to evaluate their clients' lives and their connections between early childhood attachments, the experiences they encountered, along with their relationships in later on adulthood. People that often suffer from unhealthy or insecure attachments have hurtful relationships later on in adulthood as well. Knowing the correlation and the signs of those, counselors and therapists are able to help develop coping skills, rebuild trusting bonds, and also encourage emotional security and safety within a session.
The foundational tenets of researching attachment disorders and attachment styles is an overall one-size-fits-all, a very westernized view of research and processing. However, when considering minority groups, it is very important to understand the implications that culture has on the way that family groups interact with one another, the way that they communicate, and the way that they process. So specifically speaking about the African American community and the Latino American community, they score very high in to have attachment anxiety as well as attachment avoidant styles, and this can be explained in understanding the way that their home life goes. So knowing that African American community and in the Latino community that the extended family is very prevalent in the home, whereas for other groups they would have the nuclear family of parents, siblings, but in other communities as the Latinos and African Americans have grandparents or aunts that influence the way that they communicate, influence the way that they trust one another. So understanding that there is a difference in what a nuclear family looks like in other communities or other cultural backgrounds helps to understand how attachment styles can differ. Specifically speaking about the Asian American community, who also scored very high on the attachment avoidance scale. It is understood that in their community it is dishonorable to disrupt harmonious relationships or to disrupt what seems to be normal in their family circle or in their family home. So that causes them to be avoidant or causes them to be dismissive of other relationships or causes them not to be as expressive. So just understanding the specifics of cultural norms and how this influences the way that they communicate with one another is very important to understanding how minority groups differ from the majority. I believe that in the research that I found, there was not much simply because ethnocentrism is one thing that has been ignored in the study of attachment disorders and attachment styles in minority groups, because we are all born and we all connect, we all form relationships with parents in a very similar way. However, the lack of research shows that minority groups are oppressed in different areas, not just in the media or not just financially, not just socioeconomically, but even in the areas of mental health, understanding that counseling may even be a negative stigma in the African American community or in the Latino community or even in the Asian community. And as a minority, a Black woman as myself, I can definitely attest to that part But understanding that there are
Experiential therapy
pre-existing
is a
stigmas about
client-centered
mental health
approach
and
to
about counseling and
psychotherapy
about
that helps
relationships
clients
in
focus on the present
ethnic
and understand what is
groups,
really happening in their
it was not
lives
shocking
right
to me to
now,
find that there
rather
was a
than
lack
what
of
they may
research on
perceive to be
attachment
happening
disorders and
based on
attachment
past
styles in
experience.
minority groups. But also
Instead of
understanding that
simply
this lack of
talking about
research
past
and a lack of
situations,
awareness for that part
clients are
even
encouraged to experience
has a
them,
long-lasting effect
perhaps through
on
reenactment.
the group's mental health
Through the
as a
Gestalt
whole,
process,
long-lasting
clients
into
learn to
future
become more
generations.
aware of
If
how
there's
their
no awareness,
negative
then there
thought
is no way
patterns
to
and behaviors are
fix or
blocking
to
true
eradicate the
self-awareness
issues
and
or
making
to
them unhappy.
help minority groups get
Moving
to
into
a healthier
humanistic
or more
psychology,
secure attachment
this
style
particular
in
therapy
relating to one
practice is
another.
grounded in the belief
The
that people are
prejudices and
innately good.
discrimination that minority groups
This
face
type of
also influence
psychology
the way that they
holds that
interact with other
morality,
groups,
ethical
simply
values,
because
and
if
good
they view
intentions are the
themselves one
driving
way and
forces of
view that
behavior,
feel
while
that the
adverse
world views
social and
them
psychological
another way, it can cause
experiences
them to
can
be
be
dismissive, it
attributed
can
to
cause them to be
deviations from
fearful, it can
natural
cause them to be
tendencies.
anxious in their interactions with other
In
people. So it's very important
1957 and
to understand
1958,
how
Abraham
culture,
Maslow and Clark
internally and
Moustakis met
externally,
with
the way that other
psychologists who
people
shared
view
their
a
goal of
minority groups
establishing a
affects the way that they
professional
interact with one
association
another.
that
It is also
emphasized a
plausible
more
to assume that
positive and
without these
humanistic
prejudices or
approach. The discussions
areas
revolved
of
around the topics
discrimination
they
in their
believed would become
cultures
the core
or in the
tenets of
perception of
this
their
approach to
culture, that they may
psychology:
have more secure
self-actualization,
attachment styles or may
creativity,
be able to
health,
trust other
individuality,
people or
intrinsic
other groups
nature, self,
um,
being,
with a
becoming, and
more
meaning.
flexible behavior,
Maslow's
with a
hierarchy of
more
needs
cooperative
ranks human
behavior.
needs from the most
So
basic
overall, I
physical
believe that
needs to the most
with the
advanced
research that I
needs of
found, that culture definitely does
self-actualization.
affect the way that minority groups interact with one another and the way that we view
The
them as
last
well.
therapy modality I'm going to
The
speak about
foundational
is
tenets of
couples therapy.
researching attachment disorders
Couples
and
therapy
attachment
aims to
styles is an
improve
overall
communication
one-size-fits-all,
between a
a very
romantic
westernized
relationship,
view of
change
research and
these as the
processing.
relationship,
However, when considering
modify
minority groups,
dysfunctional
it is very
behavior
important
towards each
to
other,
understand the
decrease
implications that
emotional
culture
avoidance,
has on the way that
promote
family
strength,
groups
and
interact
build
with
a
one another, the
healthy,
way that they
loving,
communicate, and the
cohesive
way that they
dynamic between
process.
two
So,
people.
specifically speaking about the African American community and the Latino
After
American
studying
community,
attachment
they
disorders,
score
I
very
realized
high
that even though human beings are
in
made in the imago
to have
Dei, which
attachment
means at the
anxiety
center
as
of
well as
all of
attachment
us is the
avoidant
ability and desire to
styles.
connect with God and
And this can
others,
be explained in
not all of us
understanding the way
have
that their
formed
home life
secure
goes. So,
relationships.
knowing
I do
that
know that
African
secure
American
relationships
community
are a
and in the
foundation
Latino
to promoting
community, that
spiritual
the
health and mental
extended family
well-being.
is very
I
prevalent
believe
in
that
the
at the root of
home,
many spiritual
whereas
and
for other
emotional
groups they would have
problems
the
is
nuclear
the
family
failure of an
of
individual
parent,
to
siblings, but
connect
in other
because of insecure
communities, as the
attachment
Latinos
styles or
and
attachment
African Americans have
disorders.
grandparents or
As
aunts
counselors, I
that
believe
influence the way
attachment
that they
theory provides
communicate,
an
influence the
understanding of
way
the
that they
development
trust one
of
another. So
ineffective coping
understanding that there is a
strategies
difference
and the
in
underlying
what a nuclear
dynamics
family
of a
looks
person's
like in
emotional
other communities
difficulties, which
or
can
other
serve as the
cultural backgrounds
basis
helps to
for helping
understand
us as
how
counselors in
attachment styles can
identifying and
differ.
resolving an
Um,
individual's problems.
Specifically speaking about the Asian
I believe there
American
needs to be
community, who
more
also scores
research
very high
conducted to
on
fully
the
understand the
attachment
impact of early
avoidance
attachment
scale.
and future
Um,
relationships,
it is
including
understood that in their
identifying
community
certain
it is dishonorable to
interventions and
disrupt
techniques that are
harmonious
effective for treating such
relationships
disorders.
or to disrupt what seems to be normal in their family circle or in their family home. So